Funny how the moment you think you understand someone is exactly when everything falls apart. The chandelier light spills across the marble floors, soft and golden, the kind of glow that makes everything look perfect, too perfect, as Adrian Blake stands at the edge of the ballroom, fingers tightening slowly around a crystal glass he hasn't taken a single sip from, his eyes locked across the room, unable to look away, because there she is, Sophie Bennett, in a simple dress that doesn't belong in a room like this, smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile he thought only existed when she looked at him, and she's giving it to someone else. The man beside her leans in, says something that makes her laugh, and that sound, light, unguarded, real, hits Adrian harder than anything he's felt in years, his chest tightening in a way he can't control, a quiet crack forming beneath the calm, controlled image everyone in this room expects from him, because they all know him as the CEO, the man who never slips, never reacts, never lets emotion interfere with precision, but none of them know the version of him that spent the last 3 months pretending to be someone smaller, someone invisible, just to understand what it felt like to be seen without the weight of his name, and none of them know that the woman laughing across the room is the only person who ever made that experiment feel real. His jaw tightens as the man reaches out, brushing a strand of hair from Sophie's face, a gesture so casual, so familiar, that something inside Adrian snaps, not loud, not explosive, just a quiet, dangerous shift, as he sets the glass down with a little too much force, the faint clink echoing in his ears while the world around him keeps moving, people talking, glasses clinking, deals being made, none of it mattering anymore, because all he can see is her, and all he can feel is the sudden, sharp realization that maybe he misunderstood everything, maybe every smile she gave him, every late-night conversation over cheap takeout, every moment she chose to stay when she didn't have to. Maybe it all meant something different than what he believed, and the thought sits heavy, unfamiliar, unwelcome. Because Adrian Blake doesn't lose control, not in boardrooms, not in negotiations, not in life, but right now, watching Sophie laugh with another man, he feels it slipping, inch by inch, the careful distance he built between himself and the rest of the world collapsing under something as simple, and as devastating, as her smile, and before he can stop himself, before logic can catch up to instinct, his feet are already moving across the polished floor, each step deliberate, controlled on the outside, but driven by something raw underneath, something he hasn't felt in years, something he wasn't supposed to feel at all, not like this, not here, not when everything was supposed to be just an experiment, just a test, just a temporary escape from a life where nothing is ever real, and yet somehow, somewhere between the lies he told and the truth she showed him, it stopped being pretend, and now, standing only a few feet away from her, watching the way her eyes light up for someone who isn't him, Adrian realizes too late that the one thing he never planned for was losing her before he ever truly had her. 3 months earlier, the city felt colder, louder, more honest in ways Adrian Blake had not experienced in years, the kind of honesty that did not care about titles or tailored suits or the fact that his name sat on the top floor of a glass tower 20 blocks away, because here, standing behind the counter of a small cafe that smelled like burnt espresso and fresh bread, he was just another guy in a wrinkled shirt with a borrowed name tag that read, Adrian, like it belonged to someone else. He remembered the first day clearly, the way the manager barely looked up when handing him the apron, the way no one cared who he was or what he owned, and for the first time in a long time, that indifference felt like relief instead of insult, until she walked in, balancing 2 to-go trays in one hand, pushing the door open with her shoulder like she had done it 1,000 times before, Sophie Bennett, her hair pulled back in a loose tie, a pencil tucked behind her ear, and a quiet kind of focus in her eyes that did not match the chaos around her. She did not notice him at first, just moved quickly, efficiently, greeting customers by name, remembering orders without writing them down, offering small smiles that felt real, not practiced, and when he finally made his first mistake, spilling coffee across the counter during a morning rush, it was her voice that cut through the noise, calm, steady, hey, it is okay, just grab the towels, no judgment, no impatience, just simple direction, like mistakes were allowed here, like people were allowed to be human, later. That night, when the crowd had thinned and the neon sign outside flickered against the window, he sat alone at a corner table, staring at his phone filled with missed calls and messages he ignored, trying to remember why he started this in the first place, and that was when she slid a plate across the table, half a sandwich, still warm. We were going to throw it out, she said with a small shrug, but he noticed the way she avoided looking directly at him. Like she did not want him to feel like a charity case, like dignity mattered even in something as small as leftover food. He should have refused, should have kept the distance, kept the boundaries of the experiment intact, but instead he took it, and something shifted, subtle but real, because no one had given him anything without expecting something in return in a very long time. Days turned into weeks, and he found himself staying longer than necessary, asking questions he did not need answers to, learning the rhythm of her life. In pieces, the second job she rushed to after closing, the way she counted tips carefully like every dollar had a purpose, the quiet phone calls she took outside when she thought no one was listening, her voice softer then, more vulnerable, and somewhere in between all of it, he stopped observing and started feeling, a mistake he told himself he could control, until one afternoon when his name tag tore loose, falling to the floor unnoticed, and she picked it up, smoothing the bent corner with her thumb before handing it back. "You should not let people forget your name," she said with a small smile, and he almost laughed at the irony, because if she only knew how many people knew his name and still never really saw him, and yet here, in a place where he was supposed to be invisible, she was the only one who made him feel like he existed beyond a title he had spent his entire life building. It started becoming a routine he did not question anymore, the quiet rhythm of mornings behind the counter, the low hum of the espresso machine, the bell above the door chiming every few minutes, and somehow, without planning it, Adrian began measuring his days by the moment Sophie was near, the way she would slide past him in the narrow space behind the counter, brushing shoulders lightly without noticing, the way she would hum under her breath when the cafe got busy, a small habit that made the chaos feel manageable, and he caught himself listening for it, waiting for it, like it grounded him in a world that finally felt real. One evening, rain tapping softly against the windows, the streets outside blurred under streetlights, they stayed after closing, chairs flipped onto tables, the floor still damp from cleaning, and for the first time, there was no rush, no customers, no noise to fill the space between them, just quiet, and she sat across from him with a paper cup of coffee. She did not seem to want to drink, tracing the rim with her finger like she was deciding how much of herself to reveal. "You ever feel like you are running all the time?" she said finally, not looking up, "like if you stop for even a second, everything falls apart." And Adrian, who had built an empire by never stopping, who had trained himself to keep moving no matter what, found himself answering honestly without thinking, "Yeah, I think I forgot what stopping feels like," and she smiled at that, not the bright smile she gave customers, but something softer, more tired, like she understood more than she said, and in that moment, something shifted again, deeper this time, because it was no longer just curiosity or admiration, it was connection, the kind he had not expected to find in a place like this. Days later, he noticed the way she checked her phone more often, the way her expression changed when a name appeared on the screen, a mix of relief and nervous energy, and once, when she stepped outside to take a call, he followed without meaning to, stopping just short of the door, catching only fragments of her voice through the glass. "I missed you too, and I cannot believe it is really you," words that lingered longer than they should have, planting a quiet unease he could not shake, and when she came back in, her eyes brighter than usual, he almost asked, almost crossed a line he told himself he would never cross, but instead he stayed silent, watching, waiting, convincing himself it did not matter, that this was never supposed to matter. The next week, it became impossible to ignore. The man who started showing up near closing time, leaning casually against the counter like he belonged there, dressed better than most customers but not out of place enough to raise suspicion, and Sophie would light up the second she saw him, that same smile, the one Adrian thought he understood, the one he now realized he never owned, and they would talk in low voices, laugh at things he could not hear, share a familiarity that felt too easy, too natural, and every time it happened, Adrian felt that same tightness in his chest, sharper now, harder to ignore, because this was not part of the plan. None of this was supposed to affect him. He was supposed to observe, to learn, to walk away unchanged, but standing there, watching her exist in a world that did not include him the way he wanted, he began to understand something he had not prepared for, something no business strategy could control, because the more he tried to convince himself that he was just passing through her life, the more it felt like he was the one being left behind. The shift from curiosity to something heavier happened so quietly that Adrian did not notice it at first, but once it settled in, it refused to leave, growing sharper with every passing day. every glance Sophie gave that was not meant for him, every laugh she shared with the man who kept appearing like he had always belonged there. It was a late afternoon when the tension finally tightened into something he could not ignore. Sunlight slanting through the cafe windows, catching dust in the air. The kind of calm that should have felt peaceful but did not, because Sophie stood near the counter, her back half turned toward him, her voice softer than usual as she spoke to the man again. Daniel. He had heard her say his name once, repeating it like it meant something important, something personal, and Adrian found himself watching too closely, noticing details he had no right to care about, the way her shoulders relaxed when he was near, the way her guard dropped in a way it never fully did with anyone else, even him. You are staring, the manager muttered as he passed by, but Adrian barely heard it, because in that moment, Sophie reached into her bag and pulled something out, a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, and handed it to Daniel with careful hands, like it mattered, like it carried weight, and whatever it was, it made the man's expression change instantly, surprise melting into something deeper, something emotional, and Sophie smiled again, softer this time. Almost relieved, and that was when Adrian felt it fully, not just discomfort, not just curiosity, but something raw and unfamiliar pressing against his control, because he did not know this version of her, did not understand this part of her life, and the realization that there were pieces of her he would never be part of settled in his chest like a quiet loss. Later that evening, when the cafe finally emptied and the lights dimmed, he found her alone near the window, staring out at the street like she was somewhere else entirely, and for a second, he almost turned away, almost let it go like he had been trying to do for days, but instead he stepped closer, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. Who is he? Simple, direct, but carrying more weight than he intended, and Sophie turned, surprised, her expression shifting as she searched his face, as if trying to understand why it mattered. Just someone I have not seen in a long time, she said after a pause, her voice careful, measured, and that answer should have been enough. It should have ended the conversation, but it did not, because it was not the truth he wanted, not the certainty he needed, and Adrian felt the frustration rise, quiet but insistent. You seem close, he added, softer now, almost controlled again, but she only gave a small smile that did not fully reach her eyes. Some people stay with you, even when they are gone, she said, and something in that sentence stopped him, not because it answered anything, but because it hinted at something deeper, something complicated. And for a moment, he saw it, the weight she carried beneath the easy smiles, the parts of her life she had never shared. And he realized he had been wrong about one thing. He had thought he understood her, thought the time they spent together had given him some kind of insight, but standing there, hearing her speak about someone else with that quiet depth, he understood how little he actually knew, and as she turned away, gathering her things, leaving him with more questions than answers, Adrian felt the fragile balance he had been holding on to begin to shift again, because whatever this was, whatever she meant to him now, it was no longer something he could step away from without consequence. The next few days felt different, like something unspoken had settled between them, not loud enough to confront, but impossible to ignore, and Adrian found himself caught in a quiet tension he could not escape, because every moment with Sophie now carried weight, every word she said, every glance she gave, every absence he noticed more than he should. It was early morning when the cafe was barely awake, the sky still pale, the streets outside quiet except for the occasional passing car, and Sophie stood behind the counter tying her apron, her movement slower than usual, thoughtful, like her mind was somewhere else, and Adrian watched her from a distance, telling himself not to read into it, not to care, but failing anyway, because the version of her he had come to know felt just slightly out of reach now, like something had shifted and he did not know how to reach it again. The bell above the door chimed softly, and without even turning, he knew it was him, Daniel, because Sophie's posture changed instantly, a subtle straightening, a breath she did not realize she held, and when she turned, that same smile appeared again, effortless, familiar, and something in Adrian tightened before he could stop it, his hand stilling on the counter as he pretended to focus on wiping a clean surface. Daniel walked in like he had nowhere else to be, calm, confident, carrying an ease that came from belonging, and this time, Adrian listened more carefully, catching pieces of their conversation as they spoke in low voices near the window. You still have it? Daniel asked, and Sophie nodded, reaching into her bag again, pulling out the same folded paper from before, her fingers brushing over it like it held something fragile, something important. I kept it all these years, she said quietly, and there was something in her voice that Adrian had never heard before, something deeper than kindness, deeper than warmth, something rooted in memory, and Daniel looked at her in a way that made everything else in the room fade. "I never thought I would see it again," he said, his voice softer now, and Sophie let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "Neither did I," and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, filled with things Adrian did not understand, filled with history he was not part of, and for the first time, he felt like an outsider in a place where he had started to believe he belonged. Later that afternoon, when Daniel had left and the cafe returned to its usual rhythm, Adrian found Sophie alone again, her gaze lingering on the door long after it had closed, and he stepped closer without thinking, drawn by something he could not name. "You trust him," he said, quieter this time, less confrontational, more searching, and Sophie looked at him, really looked this time, like she was weighing how much to say, how much to reveal, and for a moment, he thought she might tell him everything, might close the distance that had been growing between them. But instead she only gave a small nod. "More than anyone," she answered simply, and that answer landed heavier than anything else, because it was not just about trust, it was about something deeper, something rooted in a bond he could not compete with, and Adrian felt it clearly then, the line he had crossed without realizing it, the moment this stopped being an experiment and became something personal, something vulnerable, and as Sophie turned away, returning to her work like the conversation had ended, Adrian stood there a second longer, the weight of her words settling in, because for the first time since this all began, he was no longer just trying to understand her, he was trying to figure out where he fit in her world, and the answer was not as certain as he once believed. The invitation arrived in silence, not through him, not through anything personal, but as a printed card placed on the cafe counter at the start of the afternoon shift, thick paper, clean lettering, the kind that did not ask but expected attendance, and Sophie picked it up with a slight frown, reading it once, then again, her fingers lingering at the edge like she was trying to decide whether to put it down or hold on tighter. "Corporate gala," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. And Adrian felt the shift instantly, the quiet tension tightening again in his chest, because he knew exactly what it was, knew the name at the bottom of that card even before she turned it slightly, and his eyes caught the familiar logo, his company, his world, the one he had carefully kept separate from this place, from her. "You are going?" the manager asked casually, already moving past the moment, but Sophie hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the window, thoughtful, uncertain, and for a second Adrian almost stepped in, almost told her not to, almost controlled the situation the way he always did, but he stayed still, watching, because this was not supposed to be his decision, not in this version of himself, and after a long pause, Sophie nodded softly. "Yeah. I think I should," she said, her voice quieter now, like the choice carried more weight than it seemed. The rest of the day passed slower than usual, every small interaction stretched thin by the awareness of what was coming, and Adrian found himself distracted in a way he had never allowed before, missing orders, forgetting steps, his mind pulling him back to the same thought over and over again, the image of her walking into that ballroom, into his real world. Seeing him for who he actually was, not the version she had come to know, not the man behind the counter with the borrowed name tag, but the one whose decisions shaped everything around him, and the question that followed was the one he could not answer, not with certainty, not anymore. Would she look at him the same way, or would everything change the second the truth replaced the lie? That evening, as the cafe emptied and the city lights flickered on outside, Sophie stood near the back door, tying her jacket, her expression distant again, and Adrian approached before he could talk himself out of it. "You do not have to go," he said, the words quieter than he intended, not commanding, not controlling, just real, and Sophie paused, glancing at him with a small, almost amused smile. "It is just a gala," she replied gently, but he shook his head slightly, his gaze holding hers a second longer than usual. "It is more than that," he said, and something in his tone made her expression shift. Curiosity replacing ease, like she was starting to see the edges of something he had been hiding, something he had not meant to reveal, and for a moment, the air between them felt different, heavier, charged with a truth that hovered just out of reach, and Sophie tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You are acting like you know something I do not," she said, not accusing, just observant, and Adrian felt it then. The pull between staying silent and saying everything, between protecting the version of himself she trusted and risking losing it completely, and he almost told her, almost let the truth break through right there in the quiet space between them, but instead he stepped back, the moment slipping away as quickly as it had formed. "Just be careful," he said instead, the words falling short of what he meant, and Sophie watched him for a second longer before nodding slowly, like she accepted the answer but did not fully believe it. And as she turned to leave, the bell above the door chiming softly behind her, Adrian stood there in the fading light, the reality settling in around him, because the world he had kept separate was about to collide, and this time, there would be no way to control what happened next. The night of the gala arrived with a kind of quiet pressure that lingered in the air long before anything actually happened, the city dressed in light and motion, cars pulling up in steady lines outside the towering glass building that Sophie had only ever seen from a distance, the kind of place that felt untouchable, distant, like it belonged to a world she had never imagined stepping into, and yet there she was, standing just outside the entrance, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her small clutch, her reflection staring back at her in the polished glass, familiar but different, like she had stepped into someone else's life for the night. Inside, everything moved with effortless precision, laughter blending with soft music, conversations flowing easily between people who seemed to belong without trying, and Sophie took a slow breath as she stepped in, her eyes taking in the space, the height of the ceilings, the shimmer of crystal lights above, the quiet confidence in every movement around her, and for a moment, she felt it, that familiar doubt creeping in, the sense that she did not quite fit here, that she was only passing through, but then she straightened slightly, reminding herself why she came, not for the place, not for the people, but for something she still had not fully explained, even to herself. Across the room, unnoticed at first, Adrian stood exactly where he was expected to be, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that fit him like it had always belonged there, every detail precise, every movement controlled, the version of himself the world recognized instantly, and yet none of that felt real in the way it used to, not tonight, not when his attention locked onto the one person in the room who did not see him the way everyone else did, because Sophie was here now, walking carefully through a world he had kept hidden from her, her gaze curious, cautious, but still undeniably hers, and something in Adrian shifted the second he saw her step fully into the light, because this was the moment he had been avoiding, the collision he knew was coming, the point where truth would replace everything he had built between them, before he could decide how to move, how to control it, how to manage the outcome like he always did. The room shifted subtly, attention pulling toward the center as a familiar voice announced his name, clear, confident, cutting through the noise with practiced ease. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Adrian Blake. And just like that, the distance between who he had been and who he was supposed to be disappeared, leaving no space to hide, no time to prepare, and Sophie turned at the sound, her expression curious at first, her eyes searching the room until they found him, and in that instant, everything slowed, the noise fading, the movement around them blurring into something distant, because recognition did not come immediately, not fully, but something in her expression shifted, a flicker of confusion, then realization, the pieces beginning to fall into place in a way neither of them could stop, and Adrian held her gaze across the room, steady but no longer distant, no longer protected, because there was no version of himself left to hide behind now, and as the applause rose around him, filling the space with approval and expectation, the only thing that mattered was the look in her eyes, the question forming there without words, the quiet understanding that whatever she thought she knew about him was about to change completely. And for the first time in a very long time, Adrian did not know how this would end. The applause continued, steady and controlled, but for Sophie, it sounded distant, like it belonged to another room, another moment entirely, because all she could see was him, not the man behind the cafe counter with the slightly crooked name tag and quiet smile, but the man standing at the center of the room, composed, confident, someone everyone clearly knew, someone she should have recognized, and yet somehow had not. And her mind struggled to reconcile the two versions, the small details rushing back all at once, the way he spoke sometimes like he carried more than he said, the way he observed everything before acting, the way he never quite fit the role he claimed to have, and now it all made sense in a way that felt less like clarity and more like a quiet betrayal settling in her chest. Adrian took a step forward as the introduction faded, his eyes never leaving hers, and for a second it seemed like the entire room adjusted around that distance between them, people parting without realizing, conversations lowering, as if something unspoken had taken priority, and Sophie did not move, not because she could not, but because she needed that second, that moment to understand what she was seeing, what it meant, and what it said about everything that had happened between them. When he finally reached her, close enough that the noise of the room returned in fragments, neither of them spoke immediately, the silence stretching just long enough to make the truth impossible to ignore, and Sophie was the one who broke it, her voice calm but edged with something deeper. "You knew," she said, not a question, not an accusation shouted, but something quieter, more personal. And Adrian felt the weight of it instantly. Because there was no answer that could undo what had already been revealed, no explanation that could erase the fact that he had chosen to hide something this significant. "I was going to tell you," he said, the words careful, measured, but even as he spoke them, he knew how they sounded, how insufficient they felt against the reality standing between them, and Sophie let out a small breath, almost a laugh but not quite, her gaze dropping for a second before returning to him, clearer now. "Sharper, when?" she asked softly, and that single word carried more than anything else she could have said, because it was not just about timing, it was about trust, about everything she had believed without question. Adrian hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for her to see that there was no real answer, no moment that would have made it right, and she nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself rather than responding to him, and stepped back just slightly, creating space that had not existed before. Around them, the room continued as if nothing had changed, people watching discreetly, conversations resuming, but for Sophie, the distance felt absolute. Because the man she thought she knew was gone, replaced by someone she did not fully understand, someone who had chosen to observe her life without ever fully stepping into it honestly, and that realization settled in a way that did not need anger to be felt deeply. "I trusted you," she said finally, her voice steady, and Adrian felt that more than anything else, because it was simple, direct, and completely true, and for the first time that night, he did not try to defend himself, did not try to control the outcome, because there was nothing to control anymore, only the consequences of a choice he had made long before he realized how much it would matter. And as Sophie turned slightly, her attention shifting away from him, the connection they had built felt fragile in a way it had never been before, balanced on a truth that had arrived too late. The room moved on, but something between them did not, and Sophie felt it with every step she took away from him, the sound of heels against polished floors echoing softer than the thoughts in her mind, each one louder than the last, replaying every moment she had shared with Adrian, every conversation, every small gesture that now carried a different meaning, not false, not entirely, but incomplete in a way that made everything feel uncertain. And she stopped near the edge of the balcony doors, the cool night air brushing against her skin as she stepped outside, needing space, needing distance from the version of reality that had just shifted without warning. Inside, Adrian stood where she left him, the weight of her words settling deeper than any public pressure he had ever faced, because this was not a negotiation, not a deal he could restructure, not a situation he could control with strategy or timing. It was something far more fragile, something built on moments he had not fully respected when he chose silence over truth, and for the first time, the cost of that choice felt clear, not in numbers or consequences, but in the way she looked at him now, distant, guarded, no longer open in the way that had drawn him in from the beginning. He did not wait long, because waiting had been his mistake before, and he stepped outside, the noise of the gala fading behind him as he found her standing near the railing, her gaze fixed on the city lights below, steady but thoughtful, and for a moment, he said nothing, letting the quiet settle between them again, but this time it was different, not uncertain, but honest in its distance. "You are right," he said finally, his voice lower, stripped of the control he usually carried, and Sophie turned slightly, not fully, but enough to acknowledge him, her expression unreadable, and he continued, not rushing, not trying to fix everything at once. "I should have told you sooner, not because of this, not because of tonight, but because you deserve to know who you were talking to." And there was no defense in his tone, no attempt to justify the choice he had made, only the truth laid out without protection. And Sophie listened, her eyes searching his face, not for answers, but for sincerity, for something real beneath everything that had been hidden. "Then why didn't you?" she asked quietly, and this time, he did not hesitate, because hesitation had already cost him enough, because for the first time, someone was talking to me without seeing any of it, he admitted, his gaze steady, and I did not want that to change, and the honesty of it landed differently, not as an excuse, but as something more complicated, something that did not erase the hurt but explained the fear behind it. Sophie looked down for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her clutch, processing, weighing what mattered more, the lie or the reason behind it, and after a long pause, she exhaled softly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little, not gone, but no longer as sharp. "You do not get to decide what I can handle," she said, her voice calm but firm, and Adrian nodded immediately, accepting it without resistance, because she was right, and that was the part he had overlooked, the part that mattered most. Another quiet moment passed, the city stretching out beneath them, steady, unchanged, and Sophie glanced at him again, this time with less distance, not fully open, but not closed either, and him, Adrian said carefully, the question still lingering beneath everything else.